Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm delighted to introduce this virtual event with Annalee Newitz presenting their new book, Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age, joined in conversation by Arkady Martin. Thank you again for joining us virtually this evening. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series this Friday, April 23rd at 5 p.m. ET, we'll host biologist and science writer Andrew Steele for a presentation of his book, Ageless, The New Science of Getting Older Without Getting Old. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, of which we have many, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. We also have a science research public lectures YouTube channel where you can view the previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I will be posting links to purchase Four Lost Cities on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you. And thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and of course to all of you for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science, because it really, really matters in this challenging time, of course, and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm really honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Annalee Newitz is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, founder of IO9, and former editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. They are the author of the previous titles, Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, and the novels, The Future of Another Timeline, and Autonomous, which won the Lambda Literary Award, Their writing has appeared additionally in The Washington Post, Popular Science, The New Yorker, and The Atlantic, among others. Joining Annalee in our conversation this evening is Arkady Martin, author of the Hugo Award-winning novel, A Memory Called Empire, and as Dr. Anna Linden Weller, city planner and historian of the Byzantine Empire. Tonight, they'll be discussing Annalee's new book, Four Lost Cities. Publishers Weekly calls it richly detailed, progressively minded history, and archaeologist and author Sarah Parcak writes, Annalee Newitz is a brilliant writer with the heart of an archaeologist and the soul of a visionary. Four Lost Cities should open our eyes to all that may happen to our cities in the future. Vibrant and adventurous, this is a necessary book for turbulent times. We're so pleased to be hosting this event here tonight. The digital podium is yours, Annalee and Arkady.
Hello.
Hi. It's really great to be here and really wonderful to be invited to get to talk with you, Annalee, about this book. I've been looking forward to doing an event with you of some kind for a long time. And this book is just
Go ahead,
right up my alley in so many ways. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, so thank you so much to Harvard Bookstore for hosting us. And as Arkady was saying, I think both of us have been dreaming of doing an event together because we both have a lot of the same obsessions, and our fiction and our nonfiction lives intersect around cities and empire building and destruction. So yeah, this is just super great, and you guys, I'm happy to share it with you.
Yeah. I have some questions to get us started, and the one I want to lead off with is actually about something that seemed really small when I started reading Four Lost Cities, and became very important to me as I read it, which was the subtitles of each of the sections. Um, each city is considered through several chapters, but this frame device of Çatalhöyük being the doorway, Pompeii being the street, Angkor being the reservoir, and Cahokia being the plaza. These four spaces, or entry points in some cases, to me felt like an inspired way of highlighting the differences between the four cities and what they meant about the evolution of urban life. So I'd love to hear how you came up with that schema, why these four cities, why these four places or architectural modes.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you liked that. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to organize this book. And actually, the idea for those section breaks came from my editor, Matt Wieland at Norton, who said, you know, why don't you think about some type of architectural feature that really sums up what these cities are doing? And one of the kind of obsessions I have in this book is with public space and where people gather together in cities, because of course, city life is really a history of building public spaces and building and sort of public building, like the public coming together to build a thing. You know, you don't have just one person building a city ever. It's not a castle. It's a place for everyone. And so each of those architectural features is a place where people gathered. And with the exception of Çatalhöyük, which it's a very, very early city. It's a 9,000-year-old city. And many people who study it talk about it as kind of an interim form between the village and the city. They'll sort of describe it as like a mega village because it doesn't have a lot of the features of modern cities that we have come to expect. It doesn't have big open plazas. It doesn't have a marketplace. It doesn't have castles or cathedrals. And that's because this was at a time when people were first really learning to live year-round in settled communities. And so doorways into houses were basically a kind of, it's not that they were a new technology. It's not that people hadn't seen doors before, but the idea that you would have your own personal door and your own personal space accessed by a door, it created a new kind of private space, but it also at Çatalhöyük was a kind of a public space too, because people would come together in these new kinds of family groups. So each city kind of has its own system for inviting the public to mingle together. So whether it's streets or plazas or around this public water store in the reservoir. So yeah, it's a history of public space in a certain sense.
That was something I really picked up on, that it is a history of public space, which says something to me about the idea that the history of the city is a history of public space, which is not always how the history of cities is presented, in the sense that cities are often studied as economic engines or as political engines, but it usually falls to architects to talk about the history of the city as a history of public space. So where do you see this book fitting into that discussion?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think as you were saying that, I was also thinking, you know, the people who do urban planning and public policy, like as you yourself do, are people who are thinking about the public spaces. You know, they're thinking about how do we make it more pleasant for the public, or in some cases in other cities, you know, public spaces are heavily surveilled and, you know, bounded by razor wire and things like that. So public space doesn't always mean happy space. It doesn't always mean a public library. Sometimes it means, a public square that's very regulated and you know, under the control of the police. And so part of my research process in doing this book really was a journey through a bunch of preconceptions that I had about cities, many of them that you named, that the city was an economic entity or that the city was really a political entity. And a lot of writing about cities often places the agency of making the city in the hands of the rulers of the city. So, for example, you'll hear someone say, oh, Emperor Titus built the Colosseum. Actually, his dad started the Colosseum, but Titus finished it. So, fair enough. So, and it's like, you know what? Emperor Titus did not actually ever spend a single day building the Colosseum. Like, he had slaves, enslaved people were building the Colosseum. People he owned were building the Colosseum. And so I wanted to kind of reverse that and think about agency in cities belonging to the actual people who were building them and who were living in them, in the, residential neighborhoods, not in the castles and not in the, palatial manors. So it's, I guess, in a sense, it's sort of the people's history of cities, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because some of the characters who I follow in this book they're not necessarily disenfranchised. They might be disenfranchised in one way, but in other ways they might have a lot of social power. But the main thing that really ties all of these cities together in my mind is my fascination with who builds them and how they live in them, and also debunking the idea that the city is really only for one thing, and that's making money and building power for the people who rule it, because people don't come to the city to give money to the leaders of the city. They come because they want to have fun. They want to hang out in the street and like buy some hamburgers, or if they're in ancient Rome, they're probably buying lamb burgers. But like the point is that it's really, the city is a lot more
Fried things on sticks.
Yeah, fried things on sticks, bowls of stuff, booze, everybody likes that. And so that's another piece of it too, is kind of thinking about what the work that the city does for just regular people. And and a lot of that work is providing us with fun, providing us with entertainment.
It's in some ways both a history of cities as a history of public space and of city dwellers, but also a history of cities as a history of desire, of both wanting the city and the times when people don't want it anymore, and why that happens. Because we've been talking about, this is a history of 4 cities. It's a history of 4 lost cities.
Yeah.
And that's also the frame. And well, I think it's a more internal structure than the external structure of public space. I was very struck repeatedly by the investigation of why people leave and why they would want to and why they might have to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such no one's ever quite put it to me that way, that it's about desire, but you're so right. Like a huge part of this.
Always about desire.
Yeah, it is. I mean, let's face it, yes, but
Yeah.
I hadn't quite put that together because, yeah, but I think one of the ways that I explore these cities is, each of these 4 cities, we kind of get a life story of the city. It's sort of where it comes from, why people fall in love with it, what brings people there, because you go to a city, as you said, out of desire. And it might be out of desire that's really pragmatic, like I need a job. Or it might be like, I just want to meet some friends, I want to hook up with someone and not have people judge me. And then what happens is there's a breakup, right? Like this is also the story of why we fall out of love with our cities. And, I call the book 4 Lost Cities partly because I wanted to puncture a hole in the myth of cities being lost, because in fact, none of these cities are ever lost. And the idea of the lost city is really kind of a Western myth of discovery. About it's always a sort of a white European guy who like uncovers a city that no one knew about except for all the indigenous people who live there.
And go there all the time.
So, yeah, or the people who knew about it, who like live next door. So really it's about cities that get abandoned. And the reason why abandonment is an important word is that it, again, it puts agency back into all those people who have to make that incredibly difficult choice to leave their home, which is oftentimes just, emotionally difficult, but also economically difficult, politically difficult. Sometimes people leave as refugees. So it is a very like fraught process that I'm talking about, the sort of the falling in love with the city, but then breaking up with the city. And one of the patterns that emerged as I was looking at these 4 cities, but also I looked at other cities too that didn't make it into the book, or that kind of come into the book briefly and then leave, is that we see again and again that people don't really want to leave their cities, and they like them. And the reason why they start to leave is really when there's 2 factors that compound each other. One of which is just environmental adversity, whether that's climate change, and climate change meaning like they have a really bad series of droughts or floods, or the climate literally changes. Like in the case of Çatalhöyük, it became a drier climate at a certain point. And that's coupled with political instability. So cities start to be less appealing to us when they're both undergoing, like there's questions about the leadership, or the leadership becomes incredibly dictatorial and there's less freedom for people in the city. And that's coupled with things like disasters or floods. And over time, when you have, let's call it bad government, for lack of a better term, when you have bad government coupled with environmental adversity, the infrastructure of the city suffers, and the workers in the city suffer. So you start to see workers who are treated poorly, who are compensated unfairly, people who, in several of these cities, there's enslaved populations, and those enslaved people are treated worse and worse. They're given fewer and fewer opportunities for manumission. And at the same time, as this is going on, no one is repairing, broken down water infrastructure. This is really kind of the unwritten, or well, now written, I should say not unwritten, the unsung story of why people abandon Angkor, which was at the heart of the Khmer Empire. It was one of the biggest cities in the world 1,000 years ago. Almost 1 million people lived there. And it had this incredible water infrastructure because the city had very dry seasons and very wet seasons. So it's a great time to collect water in these massive reservoirs. And over time, as the city government does become more unstable, and indeed the government of the whole Khmer Empire becomes unstable, workers are just not repairing these reservoirs. And we see horrific floods, basically because dams are overtopped and the city is just inundated, and repairs aren't happening. And finally, the elites, the rulers of the city, leave. And once they leave, we actually start to see kind of a revitalization in the city. Like a lot of the workers who stay behind start recycling some of these fancy palaces and crap where the rich people lived, and they use them to repair bridges, for example. There's one example of that happening. So even then, people cling to the city, right? Like even as it's sort of falling apart. And it really takes time for people to abandon them. And that's the other piece of this pattern that we see. So we see this pattern of things that drives people away from cities. But the other pattern we see is that, except in the case of Pompeii, which is one of my cities, and it is, buried in hot ash. So everybody leaves very quickly when that happens.
Or not at all.
Rapid abandonment. But in the case of the other 3 cities, it takes hundreds of years for people to abandon them. It's not a thing where it takes a decade. And so when people sometimes will ask me, oh, is Detroit about to be abandoned? Or, is New Orleans about to be abandoned? I'm like, we can't know that. Like, it's going to take hundreds of years for these are 2 magnificent, important cities. People are not going to like abandon them in 10 years. It's going to take, like, if New Orleans is going to be abandoned, it's not going to be fully abandoned for at least 200 years. I guarantee you. So don't worry about So people out there, do not worry about New Orleans for now. But yeah, so I think, that's one of the things that we rarely appreciate, is that these relationships of desire with these locations, it's hard to quit them. Like, we love those places, and we love it because there's so many people there that we're attached to.
And they form a great part of people's identities and identity making through placemaking, through the experience of living in a city. And one of the things that the Çatalhöyük chapter was really clear about, the sort of invention of the identity card, or the signet, the personal sign of who you are, what you do, what you like, where you're from, and of needing that for the first time, because there were so many different kinds of people all very close together. And that ties for me into one of the bigger questions in this book, which is about the city and privacy, because identity and privacy seem, to me at least, to be two halves of the same coin.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's true. I think you can certainly have an identity that isn't private as well. But I think that you're right, that cities as we know them are the moment when we start thinking of identities as private, or having a private component. And that's part of why the doorway is such an important architectural feature to think about, especially in an early city like Çatalhöyük, where, this is at a time in human history when most people who were living settled lives, which is a very small percentage of people. I mean, it was a very nomadic, Homo sapiens is basically a nomadic creature. And so it was weird for us to start settling down in the first place. And most people are living in groups of like 50 or maybe 100. But Çatalhöyük has about 5,000 people, maybe more. We're not, archaeologists can't be sure. And these would have been people coming from all over the place, probably speaking different languages with different spiritual traditions, different histories. And it really is difficult to have all of these different kinds of people living together. And so you start to get this invention of like a private space where you can pass through a door. In the case of Çatalhöyük, the way the houses were built was the doors were in the roof. So you'd kind of climb up a ladder, you'd go down into this home that you had, and that was your space, like your personal space, a permanent space, which is, again, you have to imagine how weird that would be in a world full of nomads, the idea of a permanent space where no one can see you or hear you or like walk in. I mean, I'm sure realistically people could hear each other through the walls, but like it was a very different thing than living in a tent, for example, where it's quite a thin barrier. So I think that one of the interesting things to trace as we see, as cities evolve, is how people handle privacy. And it really varies a lot from city to city. Like in Chatal, we have these really closed private spaces. People are doing a lot of things in their house that later are done in public buildings. For example, there's a lot of spiritual practice that happens inside the house in Çatalhöyük, that in later civilizations you'd go to a temple and you'd have some dude on a stool telling you about your spirituality. And later in a place like Pompeii, which is part of the Roman Empire, there's this development of kind of a liminal space where you have your private home, but then there's public parts of your home because people do business, especially rich people do business in their homes. And so they have these atriums where people come in off the street and you can see them from the street. Like you can just walk by and kind of like, oh, that person has a big atrium. They must be well off. Their peristyle is huge. That was actually a thing too in ancient Rome where people would try to build like optical illusion rooms so that when you peered into the house from the street, it would look bigger than it actually was, which I thought was very relatable. Yeah, so I think that the city, I guess what I would say to conclude, because I could probably say about a billion things about this, is that the city allows us to have a really interesting patchwork of public and private identities. Like we can go to public spaces and be different people in those public spaces. and we can shield parts of ourselves in ways that we couldn't as nomads. And so it allows us to develop a new notion of selfhood. And that's because of the physical space of the city. But, and here's the icing on that cake, is that part of our identity then becomes as a member of this city, right? Like people talk about saying, they say like, I'm from Boston. And like in the United States, like we know what that means. Like that has a meaning in the same way that like being from New York has a meaning. I'm from San Francisco. And when I hang out with relatives from Saskatchewan and I'm like, I'm from San Francisco, like they have a thought of like, what does that mean to be from San Francisco?
I'm a New Yorker. This one hits me where I don't actually live anymore. I am a New Yorker who hasn't seriously lived in New York for a decade. I'm still a New Yorker. So
Yeah,
it
so
works.
you still identify as a New Yorker.
Completely.
Yeah, I think that's like one reason why like people hold on to their accents. Like even if you leave like a place, like I have friends who are from England who have not lived in England for like 20 years and they still have their accent. And they don't have to, like you can actually, you know, a lot of people lose their accents, but like people like to hold on. That's like part of who you are, you know, it's how you see the world. And so again, I think the thing that's really interesting to think about is how recent it is that we've had that as an identity, because again, Homo sapiens was a nomadic group of animals, and people didn't identify with places. They identified with tribes or with families. Maybe they identified with a range, like a kind of a place that people like returned to every year or passed through. But being like a New Yorker or being like a Pompeian or an Angkorian, it's like a whole new it's a whole new direction for Homo sapiens, really. And I think we're still wrapping our minds around it. I think we're still not sure how to deal with it.
I would agree with that. I think that so much of a lot of political trouble that humans get into currently has to do with urban versus rural, one urbanity versus another, modes of life that are specifically place linked, and places standing in for moral or ethical structures. The myth of the American heartland, which is a place which, if you say you're from there, you're saying something about your experiences, sure, but also an ethical and moral stance.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing too about cities that I can't emphasize enough is that the idea that there is this rural urban split is a myth also, because cities do not exist without agriculture. And kind of vice versa. Like it's not like you can have really one and not the other. And so what that means is that if we really want to understand a city, we can't stop at the borders of a metropolitan area. We have to spread out into rural areas and understand the relationships between rural and urban life. And those are all part of city life. Or you could reverse it and you could say, oh, this is all part of agrarian life. Either way, they are coupled. And it's very complicated right now where you have kind of global capitalism, and sometimes the farm that's feeding your city is halfway across the world. But for most of human history, those farms have been right outside the city and they've been integral. Like the cities couldn't exist without them. And so I often feel there's like this huge tragedy in the United States in kind of imagining that there's this rural urban split when in fact we're all in it
There
together.
really isn't.
Yeah.
We have all of these peri-urban spaces too, like the borderland areas where there's a movement back and forth across what is really a very porous border, if it's a border at all. And that's not just suburbia, it's like the side of a highway.
Mm-hmm.
The specific ecosystem on the side of a highway, on a inroad into a urban place. There's coyotes in Central Park in Manhattan. That's always my example of that.
Yeah, there's falcons that like eat pigeons right outside my
Oh, yeah.
window.
A falcon ate a pigeon on my brother's air conditioner once.
Oh.
True though.
There's an infrastructure problem right there.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to infrastructure, actually, there's several places in the book where you talk about layering of houses on houses. And in one place that I really enjoyed reading, because I've done a little bit of this kind of archaeological work myself, layering of archaeology on archaeology. The dig in Pompeii that doesn't dig up Pompeii, but digs up the 1950s Museum of Pompeii and also Pompeii. As a Byzantinist, our archaeology, and I wasn't an archaeological historian, but I worked with a lot of archaeological historians. Our archaeology is usually almost invisible between classical Greece, which is preserved by people who care a lot about classical Greece and like the quote unquote origins of Western society, and modern day Turkish culture or Ottoman culture. So
Mhm.
and what are you excavating? How far down are you going? Did someone 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago dig up the thing you wanted and toss it somewhere, which happens frustratingly often.
Yeah, especially at really old archaeological sites like
Mhm.
Pompeii, for example, where people have been digging there for like 200, 300 years, and throwing away stuff that now we think is super valuable. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of archaeological sites are a combination of historical periods. And I mean, the Byzantine example is fantastic. But yeah, at a lot of these sites, you know, the further down you go, the more you see essentially layers of colonialism. And at Pompeii, once you dig below a certain level, you're seeing not the Roman city, but the Oscan city that the Romans colonized. And that for a while, the Oscan city was allowed to just be itself and was kind of an ally. And then they rebelled and lost and were made into a Roman city where everyone had to speak speak Roman, Latin. You know, at the same time, we still see graffiti all over the city in Oscan,
Mhm.
like right up until the moment that it's buried. So people are still, you know, there's like the colonizers who are speaking Roman Latin. There's the indigenous folks who are speaking Oscan. There's people coming from Egypt who are speaking their languages. And, you know, we also see that at Cahokia in the United States, which is an indigenous city that was kind of at its most heavily populated about 1,000 years ago. And this is a city that was built by an indigenous group that later kind of scattered, you know, far and wide. So they're kind of the ancestors of a lot of different bands and nations. But they came in and colonized on top of like a local village. So they colonized another indigenous group, built a city on top that's just incredible. It's a mound city in the downtown area, this mound that's now called Monk's Mound. We don't know what the people who built it called it, but it has a footprint about the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It's huge. And just when you're at the top of it, you can see across the Mississippi River to St. Louis from where Cahokia is located in southern Illinois. And it's every time archaeologists go to excavate there, they first have to do what archaeologists call chunking out, which is just taking big chunks of ground up. They have to chunk out about 2 or 3 feet of agricultural churn because when Europeans came to the area, they were like, oh gosh, it looks like there was once a magnificent city here. Let's just plow it over. And so they did. And so going through that colonial layer and then the layer of the city and then the previous people who lived there. So it's like colonies all the way down. And the thing about Cahokia is that layered on top of that physical destruction of the city is also a kind of cultural destruction, right? The destruction of the memory.
Never hear about it. I mean, that's
Yeah, you never hear about it. Yeah, and it's yeah,
slow
it's
change.
yeah, it's white settler ideology of just forget about it. There were no great indigenous places in this nation. It was a virgin land. Turns out, no. And so it's buried under many layers of ideology as well as under layers of dirt. But now we're able to start seeing how big that city was and kind of recreate it by carefully excavating there.
Before we go to audience questions, which we will do very shortly, I want to pull out one line and just ask you about one single phrase, actually.
Okay. Close reading.
Yeah, well, you knew what you were getting into when you.
I'm there for it.
So you say at the close of your introduction, actually, cities are not static entities. And in the context of that paragraph, that phrase is about how does one study a city, because they're always changing. At what point do you look at it? And at what point can you say that it's begun or ended? And that's very powerful in and of itself. But what I would love to ask you about is how you imagine recording these cities in this way shifts that non-staticness of them. What do you think this does for how we think about these four cities?
That's a good question. I mean, of course, any story about a place or a person kind of fixes them and reifies them in a certain sense. I mean, part of my goal in writing this book was to kind of push back against the traditional stories about these cities and to remind people that, you know, every city that lasts for any amount of time has actually been many different cities. You know, many of our oldest cities like Istanbul, for example, it's actually had many different names and it's lived through many empires, one of my favorite cities in the world. And it really has been different places at different times. And so I hope that by telling the story in this way and by describing how these cities changed over time, that it helps people not ever look at cities as static. Even when a city is abandoned, it continues to live on in our imaginations, in our visits to them. Like when you visit Pompeii or visit Angkor, you kind of are able to imagine what it was like there. A lot of these cities were used as holy sites or graveyards after they were kind of no longer a place where people kind of just lived. And so I think, I mean, if anything is true about the city, it's that they are always changing. And even like the people living in these ancient cities were aware of that. And that's one of the things I find so fascinating. Like at Cahokia, toward the end of the city's occupation, it had been through a lot. It had gone through a lot of changes, and people living there started excavating projectile points from the indigenous groups that had lived there before the Cahokians, and they would excavate them and like treasure them. Like we see them used in like caches of treasured goods. Like we know that they were treasured objects, and it's basically their own archaeology on their own city. And we see this practice in a lot of cities. We see it at Çatalhöyük too. 9,000 years ago, people are excavating their own cities to remember what happened 200 years before. And so I think we are aware of this, but we don't think about it as much as we should, about how much our cities are like living and changing all the time. And that is, I will say, this will be my final thought, is that part of the reason cities are always changing is because cities are built by immigrants. And that is something that has been going on since cities started. Like the earliest cities like Çatalhöyük, it's built by immigrants. It's a city of immigrants. And we see this right up through the present. You don't have a city without immigration. And that's beautiful. That's part of how cities change and evolve. And it's something we need to, I think, be aware of and thoughtful about and like embrace instead of constantly pretending like that's some sort of invasion. It's like, no, this is actually how cities work. So
Just on a really basic mathematical level, you
yeah.
can't have a city without people moving there.
Yeah, exactly. And if a city is successful, people want to move there. That's the whole point. So yeah.
I like that as a final thought a lot. We have some great audience questions, and I'll just remind the rest of you that you can put yours in the Q&A box if you have them. So I will start with a question from Eduardo Martinez, who says, I was wondering about the development of cities as emergent or centrally planned. To what degree were these historical cities planned in the strong sense, like Brasilia, or more of an emergent phenomena from lots of smaller interactions and decisions? And what can we learn from these historical case studies about planning, zoning, and unregulated decision-making in and about cities today?
It's such a great question. And there's a lot of great thinkers like Spiro Kostov, for example, who's a terrific architectural historian, or was one. And he talks a lot about this idea about the difference between a planned city versus a kind of emergent or organic city. And he really thinks, and I totally buy his argument, that you can actually see in the layout of a city, whether it's been centrally planned or whether it's emerged organically. And centrally planned cities tend to follow a grid. There tends to be a kind of an organization to them that is symmetrical in one way or another. And organic cities tend to have a lot of curvy streets, a lot of areas where the streets don't quite line up. We have this in San Francisco where there's like streets that kind of go one direction, like a main street, like Mission Street, which is one of our biggest streets in the city. It goes, I guess it goes east to west, and then it switches to going north south. It's nuts, and it drives everyone crazy. And that's a sign of organic growth because people are just building stuff. The question about what we can learn from that, one thing that I can say we see in a lot of these cities, and actually in Cahokia especially, this is very, very obvious. Cities go through phases of being centrally planned and then inviting organic planning in, and then kind of going back and forth. And there's a very strong pattern at Cahokia where they go from a very clear north-south grid with houses being kind of lined up along that way, and then the city plan changes to more courtyard patterns where houses are arranged in circles around kind of a small central plaza. And it seems as if having a balance is what people desire, to go back to this question of desire. And it seems like the lesson there is that we need to leave room for both. We have to have some central planning. Like if you want your toilets to flush and you want your internet to work and you want to have some kind of road system or transit system, you really do need central planning for that. But in terms of like how to build houses or neighborhoods, I think that maybe should be more organic. And so I say should, but I mean, obviously cities are a function of their local ecosystems too. So some cities might need more planning than others. But I think we have to have both. I'm such a fan of toilets. I love them. And I like it when I love running water. Like I'm just super psyched that I live in a time of both things.
Yes.
And you just can't have that if it's all organic. Like it's just really, really hard to do. I'm sure you could, and I invite your ideas, but I think
it's really hard.
Yeah, I'm just, like I said, just so pro toilet.
Plumbing necessary. All right. Okay, I'm going to ask this question because I used to get asked it all the time, and I want to ask someone else it. This question is from Stephen Howe. Given your statement that cities are here for more than enriching leaders, these cities are also for people to have fun in. What do you make of all the recent claims that cities are dead because we've had a pandemic?
No.
Thank you.
Cities
Thank
are not
you.
dead. Cities were definitely asleep, and people, there were a lot of very overblown and ultimately debunked news stories about the idea that people were leaving cities in droves. It turned out, and these were stories that kind of came out around like April or May of last year. And they were based on these really dubious data sets that came mostly from Redfin. And it turned out once people really started digging into the data around November or December of last year, that what had really happened is that people moved from one city to the other, and also that most of that movement was done by very rich people in Manhattan and San Francisco. So people were leaving these highly, highly capital intensive areas and getting out because they could afford it. But most people didn't leave cities, and we spent a lot of time, all of us, complaining about how it was pointless to be in a city because all the fun stuff was gone, because the fun stuff all involves getting together in, small rooms and squished up, doing stuff. And I guess that my coda to that will be to say that of all of the abandoned cities that I've studied, none have been abandoned because of pandemics. Even though cities have definitely been stricken by pandemics again and again, it's a very common urban problem. Pandemics happen too fast. And as I said, unless you have a volcano that buries your city in hot ash, it takes on the order of centuries, and certainly decades for people to abandon cities. So there's never going to be a total urban abandonment because of like a 2-year pandemic. There'd have to be a lot of other stuff going on.
So here's some of the other stuff that could be going on. This question's from Joel Epstein. With most cities built at the nexus of rivers or sheltered harbors, presuming sea level rise over the next 100 years, as predicted, many, many cities will be stressed by flooding. How do you foresee this playing out for the inhabitants of cities across the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, not all cities are built like on waterways, but many are. It's definitely not a foolish thing to think. And some of those cities are going to be dealing with the effects of climate change from flooding. And then here in California, where I live, we're also dealing with out of control wildfires, which is also basically a function of transformed weather patterns that are more common under climate change. So there's going to be a lot of changes. And we do have some good examples from history of how people have dealt with this. The city of Angkor is very interesting because of the fact that it lasted for many hundreds of years in an incredibly forbidding environment, or what I would consider to be forbidding. I mean, having to every year deal with essentially seasonal floods and seasonal droughts that sometimes became very, very harsh. And yet this was a city of almost 1 million people that through good water engineering were able to survive and thrive and really create an incredible empire. So I think we're going to be rethinking basic infrastructure questions. Like we're going to be thinking about how do we build to handle floods? Do we gradually start moving the cities inland? Do we invent or not invent, but do we implement pumping systems? Do we, how do we deal with water runoff? How do we do controlled burns to prevent massive uncontrolled wildfires? And again, in terms of the wildfires that we're having in California, one of the best ideas that's coming out of public planning is to pay attention to indigenous ways of living in California before white settlers got here, because it was the practice of the folks living here, 500 years ago to do regular controlled burns, because the state's always been kind of a shithole when it comes to fires. I'm sorry, I'm born and raised in California, so I'm allowed to say that. But it really, it's not a state that is normally a place to like grow lots of oranges. Like we've just had a freakishly halcyon couple hundred years in the state, and now we're kind of going back to the norm, which is really to have not very much moisture in the plants. So yeah, like there's a lot of we really need to be, I think, looking at how indigenous groups have lived on the land, and people who really understood the weather patterns over long periods of time. But also my coda will be, there's going to be a lot of climate refugees. We're going to be seeing a lot of people who are displaced from cities because of climate change. And I hope it ends up spawning a whole culture of receiver cities, cities that are inland that are designed to welcome climate refugees and that are built sustainably. That would be my utopia. But I think there's also going to be, a lot of scenarios that are very dystopian.
Mm-hmm. That leads into what might be our last question, and I think it's a really gorgeous one, which is from Kendall Dudley. Can you talk about the special impact on refugees of having to leave a city that they loved? What are the long-term impacts on generations of forced leavers?
That's a really good question. It really, I mean, obviously there's many different circumstances of people who are leaving cities. So as I was just mentioning, during this pandemic, we've seen very wealthy people peeling off from cities, and, they are technically refugees from those cities, but, obviously they land very softly, and they're, able to kind of pick up where they left off. But I think for the vast majority of people, it does create, I think it can create intergenerational trauma. It is, a very, it is an increasingly widely acknowledged part of US history that the forced relocation of many indigenous nations was part of what has caused this ongoing trauma that is still being resolved in the United States, the trauma of land loss. It's inspired, the land back movement, which I think is actually a very, not just a pragmatic and ethical response, but also a kind of a healing response of like bringing people back to their land and giving that land back to people whose ancestors lived on it. And I think that we see like a micro version of this happening all over the United States and elsewhere too in gentrification. And gentrification, the part of gentrification that's bad is that it displaces people. It causes people to leave their homes, sometimes homes that their families have lived in for generations. So, I would really like to see more work being done to acknowledge how much trauma is connected to having to move against your will. Moving when you want to move is bad enough, but moving when you feel like you have no other choice, or you feel like your home has become unlivable, I think that's the worst. That's like watching your city crumble because it's being neglected by its government. That is a form of trauma. And it's interesting because, we're seeing this reflected in our fictional stories too. I mean, there's a lot of horror movies that are coming out that are essentially about gentrification and about that process of displacement and what happens to people who are displaced. There's a remake of the movie Candyman, which is like one of the greatest movies of the 1990s, which is all about.
I didn't know there was a remake.
Yeah, it's coming soon. And it's like the perfect time because it's all about gentrification in Chicago and how these gentrified spaces are being haunted by this extremely justifiably angry Black ghost. And I think that kind of story is a reflection of like this kind of raw trauma that people are still dealing with. So yeah, I just want to see, like I said, I just want to see more attention paid to that.
There's been some really interesting work on gentrification trauma in the Black community in the urban planning space. There's a couple of articles I read when I was in grad school, but I don't know the literature well enough to like hand them to you or our audience, and I wish I did. But I think it is something that's incredibly important, especially as we think about revitalizing, quote unquote, cities post-pandemic. Who gets to come home, basically?
And who's treated as if, who's treated like someone who belongs there. You know, I think a lot about cities signaling who's welcome by through just the language that's used. Like there'll be certain neighborhoods where signs are bilingual, and in other neighborhoods they're not. And that's just a straight up like sign of like, okay, if you don't speak this language, you're not welcome here. You know, if you're not one of the languages on our signs. But I mean, to return to your revitalization point, I think that's huge. Like, how do we revitalize a city without displacing people, without, you know, the negative effects of gentrification? Like we want the happy effects of gentrification, like new schools and better roads and like toilets, better water infrastructure. But we don't want displacement. So how do we improve neighborhoods while keeping them affordable for the people who've lived there for a really long time, or even for the people who've just come, but who can't afford, you know, a condo high rise?
These are in urban planning speak the wicked problems.
Is that a technical?
It's a term of art. Like it's from the 70s, where there was sort of a revolution in how urban planners thought about planning from a very systematized, mechanized, economics oriented, if you put these inputs in, the city will do that type of planning, to one which was more focused on people. And very rapidly, the planners who were focusing on people discovered they had problems that were not solvable the way that some of the economic problems looked solvable by changing the inputs, or like build a bigger market over there. And there's a particular article where one planner coined the term wicked problem, a problem that you can't do anything until you fix, and you also can't fix.
Oh, yes, that feels like that is kind of what we're dealing with gentrification.
It's a hard one.
Yeah. All right. Well, we haven't solved it. But yeah.
1 hour solve gentrification.
Yeah.
I would do that to students I was teaching, but not to our lovely audience.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being here, folks. That was, and thank you, Arkady. That was just awesome.
This was so much fun.
Great questions. And like everybody should get Arkady's novels, by the way, which are in fact about empire and like building infrastructure, among other things. So definitely check those out. Those are a good fictional companion to Four Lost Cities for sure.
I absolutely feel the same way about a non-fictional companion to my Tix Kalan books. This is a brilliant way of thinking about the same big questions about the world and how people live together.
The wicked problems.
Thank you both so much. This was really wonderful. So glad we were able to have you here and have this wonderful talk. This was a really fantastic conversation, as I knew it would be. And thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please do check out this fascinating book on harvard.com, and also check out Arkady's books. We have those as well. So you can just go to harvard.com and type Annalee Newitz or Arkady Martine in the search bar, and you'll be able to find them very easily. Anyway, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and stay well.
Bye.